Hello, my name is Cliff Goodwin. I welcome you here today for preaching the gospel. I'm so thankful that you have carved a little time out of your day in order to join me here so that we might open the Bible together and study God's Word. I've entitled our study for today, My Heart Toward Others. My Heart Toward Others. You know, when we think about Christianity and when we think about an individual's relationship with God through Christ, we always need to realize that there is a sense in which this operates or exists on two different planes. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, Cliff, what in the world do you mean by two different planes? Well, I mean, simply there is obviously the vertical plane in which one has a relationship with his God. But there is also a second or a horizontal plane, if you will, in which one has his relationships with fellow man. Now, this reality is reflected by Jesus as we have record in Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40. You might recall there that Jesus was asked concerning the greatest commandment, and he responded that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord thy God. But then Jesus went on and he supplied even the next greatest commandment, and that being, of course, to love one's neighbor as oneself. And so that's simply what I'm referring to when I talk about Christianity and one's relationship with God through Jesus Christ, and the fact that such really consists of two different planes, different but not disconnected. Our attitude and our relationship toward God will most certainly affect our relationships with men, and also our relationships with men, with each other here upon this earth, will also affect our relationship with God. Now, that being said, I want us to look at our hearts toward God, or making it personal, my heart toward others. Now, for this, we're going to go to a passage that deals with the human heart, though oftentimes we might not think of it in that way. I want us to go to the Beatitudes recorded by Matthew in Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 12, at the beginning of what we know, of course, as the Sermon on the Mount. Now, it will be beyond the time limits and beyond the scope of this study for us to examine all 8 Beatitudes. Instead, as we consider my heart toward others, I've chosen 3 of those 8 Beatitudes that especially relate to this consideration. And so I'd like for us to take those 3 one at a time and to do a study concerning my heart, my attitude toward my fellow man. Okay? So let's begin in Matthew chapter 5 at verse 5. This is concerning, of course, the meek. Notice that Jesus said, Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Now, there are few words that are probably more confusing to the modern mind than the word meek as it is used in the Bible. And I say that because to the modern mind, the term meek indicates, or at least it connotes oftentimes, weakness. We think of someone who is frail and weak, probably quite timid, if not altogether cowardly, a person who maybe doesn't stick up for himself because of that fear and because of that cowardice. But biblically speaking, that is not at all. That is not at all the portrait of a meek person. Now, for the purpose of our study today, I'd like to share with you 2, maybe 3 definitions or descriptions of biblical meekness. Let's begin with probably one of the more common ones, and it's quite simplistic. Meekness, biblically speaking, has simply been described as strength under control. And that's easy enough. But may I draw your attention to the word strength? See, biblical meekness it is not in any way weakness. Actually, it is strength, however, it is strength under control. Simple, yet a very adequate definition or description for this word. Now, another one that I want to share with you is the controlled desire for the best interest of another. Now, this is a little bit deeper. Notice that the idea of control is once again present. Strength under control, number one. But now, number two, we're expanding it and we're seeing more of its practical application. Controlled desire for the best interest of another person is the idea, another human being. Now you can see already how this beatitude relates to our study. My heart toward others. Okay. A meek person has a controlled desire for the best interest of his fellow man, even when his fellow man might be mistreating him. Now, this is why, in the eyes of the world, meekness is often erroneously or it is misunderstood as weakness. That's because a biblically meek person does not take revenge. A biblically meek person is not compelled to retaliate, to stick up for himself and to make sure that this person and everybody else knows that I'm not going to take this lying down. Well, that's the opposite of biblical meekness. And so oftentimes we'll see God's children act in such a way that the world might perceive erroneously, but they might perceive it as weakness. But it's not weakness at all. In fact, it is great strength under control, but it's also the controlled desire for the best interest of the abuser. Now, I know this is deep and I know it's also difficult, but this is not spirituality 101 right here that we're dealing with. Okay? This is big boy, big girl Christianity. Meekness is not easy, but it enjoys the blessing of Christ. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And I want to say more about that in just a moment. At this juncture, however, let me supply yet a third description of meekness. We're identifying it as strength under control, as the controlled desire for the best interest of another, even if that other person is mistreating you. And now, thirdly, biblical meekness would rather suffer wrong itself than to inflict wrong upon others. You ever thought about that peculiar passage in Numbers chapter 12? Let's turn over there. Numbers chapter 12, back in the Old Testament, of course. And in chapter 12 is where Miriam and Aaron oppose Moses, apparently over the Ethiopian wife whom he had married. Now, Moses evidently was going to look the other way. He was going to ignore their charges and let this go. And the Bible tells us in Numbers 12 and verse 3, now the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. Now, you can go on and you can read the continuation of Numbers 12, and you'll realize that perhaps Moses was willing to let it go, but in this instance, God was not willing to let it go. Miriam and Aaron were actually challenging Moses' authority, and Moses was the delegate, the representative of God. Thus, to challenge Moses' authority was really to challenge God's authority. And God was not going to let that go. But Moses, in his meekness, was willing to suffer wrong himself instead of inflicting wrong or harm back on the abuser. Now, all of this is very, very interesting, of course, and we could just branch out in a number of directions and we could fully flesh out meekness and it would consume, or we could attempt to fully flesh it out and it would consume our time. But here's my point for our study today. If I'm asking myself, what is my heart toward others? Then I need to ask myself, do I love other souls to the point that even while they are resistant, even while they are antagonistic toward me, am I willing to restrain myself? Am I willing to control my own impulses and my own urges, perhaps, to retaliate and to show them what's what and to take vengeance in my own hands? Am I willing to refrain from that in hopes that I can win them one day to Christ? There's no greater example of meekness than Jesus, none whatsoever, than the one who, as he was hanging on the cross, said in Luke 23:34, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The controlled desire for the best interest of another or others, even when they are rejecting and resisting you and everything that you stand for. Jesus was truly meek. Now, let's talk about that blessing. For they shall inherit the earth. Turn over with me. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. Join me there, please, in your Bible. And let's notice at verse 23, speaking of Christ once again. I've already alluded to Luke 23:34, what he said hanging there on the cross. But notice Peter's commentary, inspired commentary on that. 1 Peter 2:23, speaking of Christ, who, when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. Jesus didn't lash out in retaliation. He didn't tell the two thieves. He didn't tell the onlookers. He didn't tell the Roman soldiers what was coming their way. He didn't do any of that. He committed himself to his Father. And in his meekness, he was still concerned about the best interest of those around him. That's meekness. Now, it's interesting to me that Peter refers to this in chapter 2:23, and then just a handful of verses later, if you will, as we move into chapter 3, he then starts saying in verse 10, for he that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips that they speak no guile. Let him eschew evil and do good. Let him seek peace and ensue it. Now, these are the things that are instructed or admonished to a person who would love life and see good days. May I submit to you that meekness and its attendant qualities, things that are related thereto, such as you will find in 1 Peter 3:10 and 11, that meekness will truly give one the good life. I do not believe that he shall inherit the earth is a literal statement about one day reigning or ruling on earth with Jesus. According to Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3, this earth is going to be dissolved. It's going to be burned up. 2 Peter 3:10 through 12. I believe instead this is a symbolic statement, perhaps equivalent to our, quote, living the good life, or as Peter put it, loving life and seeing good days. That requires meekness. All right, let's move on. Going back to the Beatitudes now, I want you to move down with me to verse 7. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 7. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. As we're presently evaluating our hearts toward others, my heart toward others, this is a critical beatitude. The word merciful here pertains to having compassion. It can be employed spiritually. I can be merciful in the sense that when one sins against me and repents, I can be merciful, and I must be merciful and forgive. Luke 17:3 and 4. But it can also be applied practically, not only spiritually, but practically. Having compassion in the sense that I see someone suffering need, someone who is hurting, someone who is lacking, someone who has urgent need, and I'm moved with compassion as Jesus was, and I show that person mercy. Now, we often don't say enough, I'm afraid, that in the Beatitudes, there is an interaction, there is an interconnectivity between all 8 of these statements in Matthew 5. And so it is that this person who in verse 7 is described as merciful is really the same person described in verse 3 as a spiritual beggar. Matthew 5:3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The poor in spirit, the person who realizes and acknowledges his or her own spiritual destitution, that I'm really a spiritual beggar. What better person to be in a place then to have compassion and to show mercy on others in their destitution and in their poverty, whether spiritual or physical? Now, that's very, very important. It's only when I realize that I am the spiritual beggar of verse 3, Matthew 5:3, that I'm really in a position to be the merciful person in Matthew 5:7. I'm in a position then to see the needs of others. That is so important. Now, Jesus in his teachings elsewhere, he gave a masterful illustration of this. Let's go over to Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, and obviously when you get there, you'll recognize from about verse 25 down that this is the passage we know as the Good Samaritan. Well, we won't read all of it for the sake of time, but picking up at verse 30, Jesus answering to the lawyer said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, of all people, a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow, when he departed, he took out 2 pence, and gave them to the host, and said unto him, take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. And then Jesus turned and asked the question, as it were, to the lawyer, which now of these 3 thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves? Certainly it was not the priest who simply passed by on the other side, nor was it the Levite who at least came and looked upon the victim, but then he too passed by on the other side. No, the one who showed mercy, the one who had compassion, was a man himself who knew what it meant to be an outcast. He knew what it meant to suffer the hostility of others. So this Samaritan, he was the one who had compassion and showed mercy. You and I, when we realize that we are the spiritual beggars of Matthew 5 and verse 3, we will then be in a better position to be the merciful of Matthew 5 and verse 7. And may God help us. Truly, may God help you and me to be merciful people, because unless we are merciful to others, we will not obtain mercy. Couple of things there at work. Number one, there is obviously the universal law of sowing and reaping. Galatians 6, 7, and 8. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. Sooner or later, at some point, those who are merciful in some point, some way, some extent, shall receive mercy. But then, number two, a greater consideration, I suppose, is the fact that if we don't forgive others who sin against us, then we ourselves shall not have forgiveness. Jesus taught this following the model prayer, Matthew 6, 14 and 15. And so as you and I evaluate our hearts, my heart toward others, your heart toward others, meekness will have the controlled desire for their best interest, even when they're mistreating us. Mercy will show compassion. Mercy will see their needs and will react to their needs in compassion. Physical, yes, but especially and most importantly, their spiritual need of forgiveness. Now, number three, and finally, as we think about my heart, your heart toward others, we move down to verse 9 to maybe one of the more nebulous, we might say, of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Peacemakers. Now, we might envision maybe a man stepping between two other men. You know, they've come to blows, and he stepped between those individuals, and he's separating them and trying to calm them down and trying to get them to let cooler heads prevail. He's a peacemaker. But again, remember, the Beatitudes all have a spiritual slant, a spiritual emphasis. Keep that in mind. And so, really and truly, this is talking about someone who is interested in peace, spiritually speaking. The way one writer put it, and I'm really indebted to that writer for this, the peacemakers of Matthew 5 and verse 9, they see righteousness as the solution to every problem. Now you might say, "Now, Cliff, that doesn't compute." But wait a minute, Cliff. What about someone who's hungry, who's starving? You know that they need food. They don't need righteousness. Wait a minute. For the child of God, it is the righteous thing to do to feed that person. Really and truly, righteousness should be viewed as the solution to every problem. You know why? Because ultimately every problem traces back to sin. If sin is the poison, righteousness is the remedy. If sin is the problem, righteousness is the solution. Now, to establish this and to think about this, you need to realize with me that sin splits and sin divides. That's the very nature of sin. Consider with me, number one, that sin divides man from his God, right? Isaiah 59 in verse 2, God told Israel, "But your iniquities have separated between you and your God, and your sins have hid his face from you, that he will not hear." Sin divides man from God. But not only that, number two, sin splits or divides man from man. Going all the way back to the beginning, Genesis chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, when Cain had worshiped God in an unauthorized manner. God warned Cain that sin was crouching, as it were, at the door. And in other words, Cain needed to get a hold of it right then and there, or it was going to escalate. And Cain ignored God's warning, and sure enough, it escalated. And what did sin do? It caused a rift between Cain and Abel, and ultimately, Cain killed Abel. Sin divides. But not only that, sin even divides the individual. It divides your heart. It divides my heart. James tells us in James 1 and verse 8 that a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Sin is what robs us of peace. It takes away peace between God and man. It takes away peace between man and man. It even takes away peace out of our own individual hearts. Sin splits, sin divides. And yet Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." The peacemakers have to be those who bring with them the remedy for sin, that they're bringing the righteousness of God as it is revealed in the gospel, Romans 1, 16 and 17. Two different times in the old book of Isaiah, Isaiah 48, 22, Isaiah 57, 21, two different times Isaiah would write, "There is no peace to the wicked." There is no peace to the wicked. And yet, in between those two passages, right in the middle, as it were, in Isaiah 52 and verse 7, Isaiah gives us a passage that is used later by the Apostle Paul in Romans 10 and verse 15 in talking about the gospel of peace. If our heart toward others is what it should be, our greatest desire should be to bring the gospel of peace into their lives. Thank you so much for being with me and studying these matters today. May God help us always to love Him first and foremost, to love Him with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. No doubt about that. But may we also realize that in order to truly and wholly love God, we must also love our fellow man. Thank you again for studying with me today concerning our heart toward others. And may God bless you and help me to be more meek, to be more merciful, and to be a peacemaker. Thank you again, and visit soon the Church of Christ in your community.